Hey guys, tonight we step into a world lit by flickering gaslight and padded by the muffled hush of heavy velvet drapes. Imagine yourself standing just inside the threshold of a Victorian parlour. Lace curtains filtering the glow, every candle flame throwing shadows across patterned wallpaper, and the air carrying the faint perfume of lavender sachets tucked into sofa cushions. You aren't simply a visitor. You're a participant in a world where the rules of romance are drawn tighter than a corset laced by an impatient aunt. And here's the kicker. You probably wouldn't survive this kind of courtship because one misplaced glance or careless joke could mean social doom. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop your location and local time in the comments. It's always fun to see where in the world you're listening from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You step deeper into the room, boots creaking against polished wood. Here, every detail is loaded with meaning. A young man in gloves holds his hat just so because keeping it on indoors would be rude, but fiddling with it too long might signal nerves or worse, desperation. A young woman adjusts her posture on the sofa, careful not to lean back too far lest it suggest slovenliness, and equally careful not to sit too stiff, which might mark her as cold. The parlour, in these moments, becomes less like a cosy living space and more like a stage where reputations are quietly auditioned. Victorian America borrowed heavily from its European cousins, but it added its own flair, rules upon rules. While gaslights hissed faintly in the background, their glow revealed the invisible web of expectations around you. One smile too broad, too forward, a smile too faint, too uninterested. And heaven help you if you dared let your fingers brush against another's without some plausible excuse like passing a teacup. Historians still argue whether these hyper-specific social codes were universally enforced or if they mainly plagued the middle and upper classes. For working-class couples, after all, life often left less time for theatre. Yet, in parlours belonging to aspiring families, everything felt like a test. It wasn't enough to be charming, you had to be charming within the rigid scaffolding of propriety. Here's a fact to anchor you. By the mid-19th century, many American homes had what was known as the best parlour. This was a room meticulously decorated, often rarely used except for guests or courting rituals. It wasn't about comfort, it was about display, heavy drapery, ornate furniture, and a sense that if you sneezed too loudly, you'd knock over someone's entire dowry plan. And now for the quirky tidbit. Some young women actually kept diaries cataloguing not just who visited them, but the exact hour and minute as though recording train schedules. Imagine that today your dating app keeps a ledger of every swipe and politely reminds you, ah yes, you spoke with Daniel at precisely 7:42 p.m. last Thursday. Creepy, yet oddly efficient. In that space, even laughter had limits. Too loud and you were accused of being coarse. Too soft and you risked seeming humourless. And all the while, elders perched like gargoyles in the corners, pretending to mend stockings or polish spectacles, but in reality, judging the rhythm of every conversation. Think about how strange it feels compared to modern dating apps. Swipe left? That's easy. But here, you might as well be swiping in real time with your eyes, hoping that a glance across gaslit shadows doesn't read as either scandalous or dull. And if you're wondering how exhausting it must have been, yes, it absolutely was. That's why so many novels of the era quietly poke fun at these rigid dances. The tension between desire and decorum practically wrote itself into melodrama. The velvet gloves weren't just fashion, they were armor. They meant fewer chances for accidental skin-to-skin encounters, but also added a layer of mystery. Were his hands calloused from honest work, or smooth from too much leisure? You'd never know. And honestly, maybe that mystery was part of the fun. You linger there in the parlour, the hiss of the gaslight like a steady metronome. Every second stretches and the rules pile higher. You're beginning to realize that in Victorian America, dating wasn't about spontaneity, it was about survival, one polite smile at a time. You shift slightly in your seat and it hits you. Every movement here feels like it's under surveillance. Courtship in Victorian America wasn't just a private affair between two hopeful hearts. It was a family business, a spectator sport with referees stationed in every chair. Mothers perched like hawks, fathers lingering in doorways, and sometimes entire extended families hovering in the background, as if a young couple's tentative conversation were tonight's main entertainment. Imagine trying to flirt with someone while Aunt Gertrude clinks her teacup too loudly every time you lean an inch too close. That's the atmosphere you find yourself trapped in. Even a simple question, "Do you enjoy music?" carries the weight of an interrogation. Because in this room, it's not just about what you say, it's about how the family interprets it. Here's the mainstream fact. In the mid-19th century, the process of calling was formalized. A young man would first request permission from the young woman's parents to visit her. He'd then arrive during a designated calling hour, often on Sunday afternoons, and his presence would be noted like an entry in a ledger. Families even kept little trays near the door to collect visiting cards, which functioned like a physical guestbook of suitors. But here's the quirky tidbit. Some families became so strict about controlling interactions that they used actual parlor chairs with oddly short seats designed to keep visitors perched uncomfortably upright. Try leaning too close on one of those and you'd feel like you were sliding into a chasm. Interior designers, it seems, were low-key accomplices to the guardians of propriety. Historians still argue whether these supervisory tactics stemmed primarily from genuine concern for daughters' reputations or from the economic stakes of marriage negotiations. After all, a misstep in courtship didn't just risk embarrassment, it could jeopardize alliances, dowries, or business prospects. A daughter marrying beneath her might mean financial ruin, while a son entangled with the wrong girl could taint an entire family name. So you sit there, trying not to scratch your nose, while a stern father pretends to read his newspaper but somehow never turns a page. He's clocking your posture, your tone, the length of every pause. And yes, mothers wielded enormous power in this theatre of supervision. They weren't just passive chaperones. They actively orchestrated who got FaceTime with their daughters, who was encouraged to return, and who was quietly shown the door after a polite but chilly evening. Think about how bizarre this is compared to modern dating. Imagine if every time you grabbed coffee with someone, their parents sat 2 tables away, sipping lattes and noting your choice of pastry. "Ah, he ordered the scone? Probably unreliable." That's basically the Victorian equivalent. And there was another layer, timing. Young women weren't allowed to receive visits at odd hours. Morning was too intimate, evenings could be dangerous. Afternoons were safest because they were less likely to slip into candlelit ambiguity. Yet paradoxically, many households only permitted visits at night under gaslight. Precisely so, the suitor's behavior could be more easily monitored in the glow of one room. The strangest part? Couples weren't expected to actually be alone together, ever. Privacy was considered suspicious, which meant, ironically, that some of the most genuine connections happened not in these staged parlor visits, but during fleeting moments outside supervision. Brief walks to fetch more tea, hushed exchanges in hallways, or stolen whispers, while a chaperone dozed off mid-knitting. And of course, gossip leaked through every crack. A suitor who stayed too long one Sunday could be the talk of church pews the next morning. Families calculated appearances down to the minute. Too short a visit, and it looked like indifference. Too long, and it hinted at impropriety. It was the ultimate Goldilocks zone, with reputations balanced on teacups. You shift again in that stiff chair, realizing that dating here wasn't about sparks, it was about strategy. You're not just wooing the young woman in the floral dress, you're auditioning for an entire family panel. And unlike modern reality shows, there's no vote them off button, just the slow suffocation of silence if you fail to impress. The first sound you hear is the gentle clink of glass against porcelain, and then comes the rustle of paper, a calling card being set delicately upon a silver tray. To you it looks like nothing more than a small rectangle of cardstock, embossed perhaps with initials or adorned with a decorative border. But here, in Victorian America, it is practically a weapon of courtship, a ticket to possibility, and sometimes a landmine. The ritual goes like this. You arrive at the door, stiff in your best coat, and you hand your calling card to a servant, or if the family can't afford one, directly to the mother herself. The card announces not just your name but your social standing, your seriousness, and even, in some cases, your aesthetic taste. A well-designed card whispered, "I am respectable." A smudged or cheaply printed one screamed, "Avoid me at all costs." Here's your anchor fact. By the mid-19th century, American etiquette manuals devoted entire chapters to calling cards. There were rules about font size, card thickness, and even the proper way to fold a corner. For instance, turning down the upper right corner could signal a personal visit rather than a business call. These tiny paper gestures carried more coded language than some people's entire love letters. And the quirky tidbit? Some men, eager to demonstrate their flair, carried calling card cases shaped like miniature pistols or engraved with bizarre slogans. Imagine pulling out what looks like a tiny revolver, only to slip a card into a tray. Victorian America had its sense of humor, albeit a slightly awkward one. Historians still argue whether calling cards actually smoothed the dating process or just added another obstacle. Did they really help a shy suitor get noticed, or did they simply allow families to prejudge people before they even opened the door? One scholar even compared the practice to a romantic resume, useful but hardly personal. You lean closer and picture the mechanics. A stack of cards rests on a hallway table, names overlapping like a guest list. Mothers scan them with the intensity of a banker examining accounts. "Ah, Mr. Johnson left one last Tuesday," she murmurs. "But he hasn't returned. Perhaps not serious enough." Meanwhile, your card might sit buried beneath a dozen others, waiting to be noticed, like a neglected profile buried in a dating app's algorithm. What strikes you most is how much emphasis was placed on subtlety. You couldn't just barge in and demand affection. No, you had to announce yourself through cardboard first, then await judgment. Families might keep cards for months, as though storing evidence of potential suitors in a small, paper-based museum of longing, and heaven forbid you violated etiquette. Delivering a card at the wrong hour or leaving it in the wrong tray could ignite a minor scandal. It wasn't enough to mean well, you had to know the choreography. Imagine today if you needed the perfect Instagram bio font to be taken seriously, and the wrong emoji choice could end your shot at love. That's how precise it was. But there was also something strangely romantic about it. A young woman, glancing over a tray, might linger a second longer on one name. Maybe she remembered the gentleman's smile from church, or maybe she admired his neat handwriting. That single piece of paper could spark an entire evening of whispered speculation between sisters. And of course, cards weren't just for introductions. Some were left behind as tokens of ongoing interest. A suitor might call weekly, his cards forming a breadcrumb trail of persistence. Families watched patterns closely. Too many visits? He's overeager. Too few? He's insincere. Again, that impossible Goldilocks standard. You sit back and realize that dating in this era was less about spontaneous connection and more about maintaining appearances in layers of paper, ink, and polite performance. It's like speed dating, except every round is conducted by postal service and judged by family committees. Still, the ritual had its defenders. Some claimed calling cards added dignity, preventing awkward confrontations. Others said it turned romance into bureaucracy, and maybe both are true, but as you finger the edge of one stiff little card, you can't help but feel the weight of all those unspoken hopes pressed between its embossed letters. The chair beneath you is stiff, upholstered in fabric patterned with flowers that no one has watered in years. And yet, this is where the most dangerous game of the century plays out. The parlour. You're not outside under the stars, you're not in a candlelit tavern, you're in someone's living room, surrounded by wallpaper, a mantel clock ticking too loudly, and 3 sets of watchful eyes counting every word you say. Parlours were more than cosy gathering spaces. In Victorian America, they were the prime stage for courtship. If you wanted to spend time with someone you admired, you didn't ask them out to dinner. That would have been scandalous. Instead, you called upon their family and hoped you'd be invited into the parlour. where you and your prospective sweetheart could sit within sight of chaperones. Romance became less of a private spark and more of a group project. Here's the mainstream fact: most homes of even modest means tried to maintain at least one best parlour. It was a display room, often reserved for visitors and courtship, decorated with ornate furniture, velvet drapes, and sometimes a piano. These rooms weren't used for everyday life. Families saved them for occasions when appearances mattered most, like suitors' visits or the pastor's inspection. It was a room staged like a theatre set, complete with props to suggest refinement. Now for the quirky tidbit: some parlours actually contained parlour organs that no one really knew how to play. They were purchased to project refinement, even if the family's musical talent extended only to whistling. Imagine buying a grand piano today just to let it gather dust because you want neighbours to think your children are prodigies. Historians still argue whether the parlour acted more as a safeguard for young women or as a prison that limited their ability to truly connect. Was it about protection or was it about control? The debate continues, and as you sit stiffly on that couch, you can feel both sides pressing down. The parlour wasn't just a physical space, it was a pressure cooker. Every detail became a test. How you handled the teacup mattered. Hold it too loosely, you're careless; too tightly, you're anxious. How you adjusted your posture. Slouching could be seen as lazy, while leaning too far forward looked aggressive. You were expected to find the exact middle ground between eagerness and aloofness, and you had to hold that position for hours while making small talk about church sermons or the latest snowfall. Think about how terrifying this would be compared to today. A first date now might involve pizza and a movie, low stakes, casual clothes, maybe an awkward silence or two. In the Victorian parlour, one awkward silence could follow you to the next Sunday's sermon, whispered about behind fans. A sneeze at the wrong moment might derail your chances forever. And remember, you were rarely truly alone. Chaperones lingered with purposeful nonchalance, knitting quietly, reading in the corner, or pretending to nap with one eye slightly open. The room was saturated with the hum of judgment, even when nobody spoke. You wanted intimacy, but all you got was theatre. Still, young couples found ways to adapt. The parlour's constraints sparked creativity. A shared glance across a tea tray could feel electric. The brush of fingers while exchanging a book might be the boldest move of the night. You start to realize that when freedom is restricted, people squeeze meaning into the tiniest gestures. A pause before answering, a faint blush, a change in tone, all became signals in the parlour's elaborate code. Yet not all parlours were equal. Wealthy families staged theirs like museums, cluttered with velvet curtains, oil paintings, and decorative busts. Poorer families might have just one sofa and a stove, but even then, the same rules applied, propriety above all. No matter how humble the surroundings, the parlour's social weight was immense. And just when you think you've navigated the evening, the clock chimes. Time limits mattered. Stay too long and you risk appearing improper. Leave too early and you seem disinterested. Families noticed everything. They might even keep mental tallies of how long you lingered. It was less about enjoying the moment and more about passing an unending audition. So you sit, back straight, palms sweating, trying to remember which topics are safe and which ones might lead to raised eyebrows. You smile at the young woman across from you, knowing that even this smile is being graded. The parlour has swallowed your spontaneity whole. Here, romance is carefully supervised, choreographed, and judged in silence. And oddly enough, that makes it feel both suffocating and strangely thrilling. The clock ticks on, and suddenly you become hyper-aware of the weight of your own body, the angle of your elbows, the placement of your hands, the way your boots are pointed on the rug. In Victorian America, propriety wasn't just a suggestion, it was a survival strategy, and even the tiniest misstep could be magnified into scandal. Let's start with the handshake, that seemingly innocent gesture. You might think a firm grip was a sign of confidence, but here it could be seen as brash, even vulgar. A limp handshake, well, that marked you as weak or indifferent. You were supposed to find the mystical middle ground, gentle enough to show refinement, but not so delicate that you seemed lifeless. And all this from just clasping hands for 2 seconds. Here's your mainstream fact. Etiquette manuals of the mid to late 1800s devoted entire chapters to correct deportment. These weren't light-hearted reads, they were dense instruction books detailing how a person should sit, stand, bow, shake hands, and even laugh. Some manuals claimed that one's character could be judged entirely by posture. A straight spine suggested honesty and moral strength, while a slouch whispered of weakness and secret vice. Now for the quirky tidbit. Some etiquette books went so far as to prescribe exact angles for head tilts during conversation. Tilt too far left, you looked distracted. Tilt too far right, you risked seeming flirtatious. Imagine trying to hold your head like a compass needle just to avoid offending someone's aunt. Historians still argue whether these codes were universally followed or more aspirational than practical. After all, a farmhand trudging home after 12 hours of labor probably wasn't tilting his head at mathematically correct degrees. But in urban drawing rooms and parlors, the pressure was very real. People read those manuals, memorized them, and judged one another harshly if they slipped. Even conversation was laced with landmines. You could discuss weather, church, literature, or travel. Politics? Risky. Money? Crass. Anything hinting at passion? Absolutely forbidden. And yet couples had to find ways to signal interest. You'd think subtle flirting would be allowed, but no, it had to be cloaked in safe topics. "Yes, I too enjoy Dickens," you'd murmur, secretly hoping she'd hear, "I think about you at night." You catch yourself chuckling, because compared to today's dating world, this was like playing chess blindfolded. You couldn't just say, "I like you." You had to imply it through posture, tone, and the precise level of enthusiasm when complimenting the embroidery on her sleeve. The absurdity borders on comedy. And yet the stakes were deadly serious. A young woman who leaned too far forward in laughter might be labelled forward, a word that clung to reputations like glue. A young man who crossed his legs too casually might be whispered about as uncouth. One ill-timed giggle could become fodder for weeks of gossip, relayed from sewing circles to church aisles until everyone in town knew you had laughed too freely. There's a kind of irony here. In trying so hard to appear proper, people often came across as stiff, nervous, or downright robotic. The performance of decorum sometimes erased the very spark that makes romance possible. But maybe that's why tiny moments, an unguarded smile, a slip of laughter, carried such electricity. When you're locked in a cage, even the smallest crack feels like freedom. You lean back, carefully, not too far, and notice the wallpaper pattern repeating like a judge's gavel. Every detail in this parlor is part of a larger choreography. The family expects you to know the steps, and if you stumble, they won't scold you directly. Instead, they'll silently mark you down, and the next time you arrive with your calling card, it might be left to gather dust in a tray rather than ushered into the room. It's exhausting, yes, but it's also a peculiar kind of theatre. You aren't just a person here, you're a character in someone else's play. And the lines you deliver aren't spontaneous, they're scripted by etiquette, whispered by manuals, and enforced by gossip. And so you adjust your posture once more, keeping your voice low, your smile measured, your gaze respectful. Because in this world, survival depends not on who you are, but on how convincingly you can play the role of proper suitor. Your knees finally get a reprieve when the conversation shifts, because nothing broke the monotony of the parlor quite like a walk in the park. At last, you step outside and the heavy drapes give way to the rustle of trees, gravel paths, and the faint chatter of strangers. Victorian America had strict rules about dating, but public spaces like parks and promenades offered carefully supervised breathing room. The stroll was the ultimate compromise. Families allowed it because it happened in daylight, with witnesses milling about. Couples cherished it because, in between all those witnesses, there were still little moments to lean close, whisper softly, or even, if the stars aligned, brush elbows without Aunt Gertrude glaring from across the room. Here's your mainstream fact. By the mid-19th century, cities across America were investing in large public parks. New York's Central Park, for instance, opened in 1858 and was designed not just for recreation, but also as a respectable place for promenades. Couples could walk there safely, their reputations intact, because being seen in a park was considered wholesome and proper. Now for the quirky tidbit, park designers intentionally installed benches with curved armrests, making it difficult for young lovers to sit too close together. Yes, even the furniture was out to ruin your romantic momentum. Imagine a society so paranoid about impropriety that it engineered anti-cuddling technology into the landscaping. Historians still argue whether these strolls truly offered freedom or whether they were just extensions of the parlour, larger, leafier cages with more witnesses. Some accounts suggest couples found parks liberating, slipping into hidden groves where chaperones couldn't follow. Others claim these walks were just another arena for showing off social standing, with suitors judged on their attire, gait, and conversational polish as they circled the fountain. As you walk, gravel crunching beneath your boots, you'd notice the strange blend of relaxation and pressure. The air smells of cut grass and blooming roses, but there's also the unspoken awareness that every passerby could be evaluating you. Did he tip his hat properly? Did she keep her gaze demurely lowered? Even the birdsong feels like it's judging you. And yet here lies the thrill. Outside, there are stolen opportunities. A couple might lag just a step behind their chaperone, whispering about books, or daring to exchange a fleeting touch. Sometimes it was as small as passing a folded note in the shadow of an elm tree. Compared to the rigid parlour, these moments felt intoxicating, proof that love could still wriggle through the cracks of propriety. But strolls were also traps. Being seen in the park with the wrong person could ignite gossip. Did you notice Miss Turner walking with that Mr. Harris twice in 1 week? The rumour mill spun faster than a carriage wheel, and suddenly a casual walk could morph into a presumed engagement. And heaven forbid you broke things off later, whispers of fickleness clung like burrs to reputations. You can't help laughing at the contrast with modern life. Today, walking together in a park is practically the lowest bar of dating, an afterthought compared to dinner or movies. In Victorian America, it was headline news. A promenade meant intention, a visible declaration of interest. Every step was watched, weighed, and whispered about. And so you stroll on, careful to keep your distance just right. Not too far to seem cold, not too close to spark scandal. The bench, with its cruel armrest, mocks you, but the breeze softens the moment. For a few precious minutes, with leaves rustling above, the world feels just a little freer. And even though propriety looms like a shadow, you sense the possibility of something more than rules, the possibility of connection, sneaking through in stolen glances and shared footsteps. You return from the park stroll, but the evening is still young. And so another curious ritual unfolds. Reading together. Imagine the scene, 2 chairs drawn close to a small table, a kerosene lamp glowing faintly, and a book, probably thick enough to double as a doorstop, resting between you. To modern ears it might sound like a snooze fest, but in Victorian America, reading aloud was one of the slyest ways to linger near someone without raising alarms. The mechanics were innocent enough. One person would read aloud, while the other listened. On the surface, it was about sharing literature, edifying the mind, or practicing elocution. But underneath, it was about proximity. Chairs that would never be allowed to edge together during casual conversation could slide closer under the excuse of catching the light, or, conveniently, catching each other's sleeves. Here's the mainstream fact. Victorian families placed huge importance on reading as a wholesome pastime. Magazines, serialized novels and poetry were staples of middle-class homes. Reading together was encouraged as a moral activity that built intellect and character. In fact, etiquette books often praised it as one of the safest ways for young people to spend time in each other's company. Now for the quirky tidbit. Some etiquette guides warned against reading overly sentimental novels together, claiming they might inflame passions. Instead, safer material like sermons or travel accounts was recommended. Imagine sitting down with your crush and being forced to read 30 pages about railroad timetables while pretending you're enchanted. Historians still argue whether couples genuinely cared about the books, or whether the whole exercise was just a sanctioned excuse to breathe the same air. Diaries suggest both were true. Some pairs bonded over Dickens or Longfellow, while others admitted later that they remembered nothing of the words, only the thrill of listening to the voice beside them. You picture it now, the young man stumbling a little over the text, his voice rising and falling, while the young woman leans in ever so slightly, ostensibly to hear better. In reality, she's testing boundaries, seeing if her sleeve might brush his. A sleeve brushing another sleeve was the 19th century equivalent of sending a heart emoji. It carried more weight than an actual kiss might today. And oh, the drama if someone misread the tone. Too much enthusiasm in a love poem. Scandalous, too little interest in a passage about virtue. Suspicious, the performance of reading had to strike the same impossible balance as everything else in this world. Just enough feeling to seem human, not enough to seem improper. Think about how strange it would be today to sit across from a date and take turns reading Moby Dick. By chapter 3, you'd both be asleep, or worse, pulling out your phones. But back then, the act was electric. It gave couples time to listen, time to observe, time to let silence stretch into something meaningful without anyone screaming indecency. Even the pauses mattered. When the reader stopped to wet his lips or turn a page, the silence felt heavy, charged. Would the other fill it with a polite comment or let it linger, hinting at a shared awareness? Every beat of quiet became a signal, coded in ways outsiders couldn't detect. You glance around and notice the chaperone nodding off in the corner. Perfect. This is the window. A hushed laugh, a whispered line, maybe even a glance over the top of the book. It was in these fragile gaps that romance crept in, sly as a cat on velvet carpet. So you sit there, the lamplight flickering, the book heavy in your lap, your voice steady, but your heart racing. You don't remember half of what you're reading, and neither does she. Because the point was never the story on the page, it was the one being written silently between the two of you. The book closes with a quiet thump, and suddenly the evening shifts again. Tonight isn't confined to the parlour, it spills into the ballroom, where the true theatre of Victorian courtship plays out. Imagine it. Chandeliers dripping with crystal light, violins humming, skirts sweeping like tides across polished wooden floors. Here, the ritual of dance cards reigned supreme, and every twirl carried consequences. You take one of those delicate little cards into your hand. It's no bigger than a playing card, decorated with ribbons, sometimes even perfumed, and it dictates the entire night. Ladies wore them on their wrists, tied with silk, and men politely requested a dance slot by writing their names in pencil. It wasn't simply scheduling, it was strategy, reputation, and flirtation all condensed into tiny squares. Here's the mainstream fact. In the 19th century, dance cards were an essential tool at formal balls across America and Europe. They prevented chaos on the dance floor by making sure no lady was overwhelmed or left sitting out. But more importantly, they let everyone track who was dancing with whom and how often. It was a social record, almost like a public scoreboard of affections. And the quirky tidbit? Some young women treated their dance cards like trophies, saving them afterward as keepsakes. Years later, these cards turned up in scrapbooks, pressed flat alongside dried flowers and old ribbons. Imagine flipping through your grandmother's diary and finding a century-old date log with names penciled in, half erased, but still whispering of long-forgotten crushes. Historians still argue whether dance cards empowered young women by giving them control over their evening, or trapped them in yet another framework of propriety. On one hand, a woman could refuse to write a name down, effectively rejecting a suitor without creating a scene. On the other hand, the cards exposed her choices to public scrutiny, since anyone could glance and see the night's lineup. Privacy, again, was never truly possible. You step onto the dance floor now, aware of how much is at stake. A waltz wasn't just a waltz, it was a sanctioned opportunity for physical closeness, one of the rare chances to place your hand on someone's waist in public. That single touch, innocent by modern standards, could set hearts racing and tongues wagging. A young woman's reputation could soar or crumble, depending on who she chose to glide with under those chandeliers. And oh, the choreography beyond the steps. You had to know how to bow, how to lead, how to end the dance without lingering too long. Each mistake was magnified in gossip the next day. Did you see how clumsy he was in the quadrille? Clearly unsuitable. Did you notice how she allowed 2 dances with the same gentleman, practically encaged? You chuckle at the absurdity because it sounds like a reality show scoreboard. 2 dances in a row, elimination round, Mr. Curtsy, negative points. But in that world, people took it with deadly seriousness. For young couples, though, the dance floor offered moments of rebellion. A whispered joke during a promenade, a deliberate pause before the music resumed, even the brush of fingertips during a turn. These were little sparks hidden in plain sight. The orchestra played decorum, but the couples danced defiance. Imagine the weight of your name on a card, penciled in beside hers. The paper grows warm in her palm as the violins swell. For the length of one song, you're not trapped in a parlour under watchful eyes. You're part of a swirling constellation of music, lace, and fleeting freedom. And when the dance ends, you bow, retreat, and the chaperones nod in approval. But inside your pulse is hammering, because that one square on a flimsy little card has carried more meaning than hours of small talk ever could. The chandeliers dim, the violins fade, and soon you find yourself back in the quieter theatre of romance, the exchange of letters. Paper, ink, and postage became the secret arteries of Victorian-era courtship, pulsing with coded affection and carefully measured words. Forget late-night texts or emojis. Here, every sentence could be scrutinized, every smudge of ink a potential revelation. The process was ceremonial. A gentleman would compose a letter in his neatest hand, sealing it with wax, sometimes even perfuming the envelope. Delivery wasn't as simple as slipping it into a mailbox. Sometimes letters had to pass through the careful gatekeeping of parents or servants. A young woman might only receive it during designated hours under the careful eye of her mother, who sometimes read it first. Privacy was a luxury few could afford. Here's your mainstream fact. 19th century etiquette books laid out strict rules for correspondence. Letters had to be polite, formal, and, most importantly, written on quality paper. Cheap stationery was seen as an insult. Even the colour of ink mattered. Black or dark blue was considered dignified, while bright colours bordered on scandalous frivolity. Some guides even suggested that overly decorative handwriting revealed an unserious character. Now for the quirky tidbit, lovers often developed secret codes within their letters to dodge parental oversight. A slightly tilted signature, an extra flourish in the Y, or even the deliberate placement of a postage stamp on the envelope could all carry hidden meaning. One common trick. Placing the stamp upside down meant, "I love you." Imagine trying that with modern email, sending your crush a message with the subject line typed backwards as a confession. Historians still argue whether letter writing was liberating for young lovers or just another layer of surveillance. On one hand, it allowed couples separated by geography, or chaperones, to communicate more openly. On the other, families often intercepted, censored, or even destroyed letters if they disapproved. Diaries from the time record young women hiding stacks of forbidden notes beneath mattresses, terrified of discovery. You can see it play out now. A young man hunches over his desk by candlelight, the scratch of his pen almost louder than his heartbeat. He agonizes over every phrase. Too direct, and he risks impropriety. Too bland, and she'll think him dull. He sprinkles in a Shakespearean line for flair, then crosses it out, fearing it too bold. Meanwhile, across town, she waits impatiently, her own pen poised to craft a reply that signals interest without tipping into recklessness. The act of waiting for the post added to the drama. Days stretched like weeks as lovers anticipated responses. A delayed letter could cause full-blown anxiety. Was it lost? Was it intercepted? Or, worst of all, was it deliberate silence? Entire relationships teetered on the whims of postal schedules. And when letters were finally exchanged, they weren't just read once and discarded. No, they were cherished, folded, reread until the creases deepened. Some were tied in ribbons and hidden away like treasures, their words memorized until they echoed in the reader's dreams. Others were destroyed in panic, burned in fireplaces before prying eyes could discover them. It's funny to compare it to modern dating. Today, you might overthink the timing of a text reply. Should I wait 10 minutes before responding? Back then, you might wait 10 days, and by then, your entire emotional state could have shifted. So you linger in the lamplight, imagining ink drying slowly on creamy paper, sealing wax cooling into hardened red droplets, and hearts carried on horseback through mud and rain just to whisper across distances. In Victorian America, love didn't come quickly. It arrived in envelopes, trembling with restraint, and always at the mercy of the post. The envelope is opened, the ink smudges are studied, and yet courtship isn't sustained by words alone. Now comes the ritual of tokens, small, tangible offerings that carried meanings too delicate or too risky to be spoken outright. Forget diamond rings on first dates. In Victorian America, gifts were subtler, stranger, and sometimes downright odd by modern standards. Flowers were the obvious choice, but they weren't just pretty, they spoke their own language. A red rose whispered passion, a white lily implied purity, and a yellow carnation, believe it or not, often meant rejection. You couldn't just grab a random bouquet and hope for the best. You had to know the floral code or risk accidentally declaring eternal friendship when you really wanted lifelong devotion. Florists thrived on this complexity, and couples used it as a secret communication system when words failed. Here's your mainstream fact. The language of flowers, or floriography, was immensely popular in 19th century America. Whole guidebooks explained which blooms signified what, and young people carried them like dictionaries of affection. Giving flowers wasn't casual. It was closer to writing a poem in petals. And the quirky tidbit? Some lovers exchanged locks of hair, braided into jewelry or tucked into lockets. Imagine receiving a bracelet woven from your sweetheart's hair, half tender, half creepy, but deeply sentimental to Victorians. Hair was personal, enduring, and intimate. One diary even describes a girl treasuring a single curl of her beau's hair for decades, long after the romance fizzled. Historians still argue whether these tokens carried more weight than they appear to us today. Were they genuine, heartfelt gestures, or were they just another rung in the endless ladder of etiquette? A bouquet, after all, could be read differently depending on the context. A violet pressed into a Bible might look innocent to a parent, but to the recipient it screamed of devotion. The ambiguity was both protective and maddening. You picture a nervous suitor fumbling in his pocket for something small, perhaps a ribbon tied around a button, or a tiny book of poetry with an inscription hidden in the margins. Tokens didn't have to be grand. In fact, sometimes their very modesty made them powerful. A pressed daisy could hold more weight than a jewel because it said, "I thought of you in this exact moment and I wanted you to know." Of course, tokens also carried risks. A girl flaunting too many trinkets from suitors could be accused of vanity. A man too quick with gifts might be labelled reckless or, worse, insincere. Balance was everything, as always. One gift too few, and interest was doubted. One gift too many, and eyebrows shot skyward. And then there were the more eccentric tokens, seashells brought from seaside holidays, scraps of ribbon from a dance card, even pencil sketches done hastily on the back of envelopes. These weren't about value, they were about presence, proof that someone had been there, thinking of you. Think about how far we've drifted. Today, tokens of affection might be selfies, playlists, or the occasional stuffed animal won at a fair. Back then, it was a sprig of lavender tucked into a prayer book, hidden like a secret flame. You turn the ribbon over in your hands, feeling how fragile it is, and yet how heavy with unspoken promise. For Victorians, tokens were more than objects. They were chapters in a silent novel of love, written not with words but with petals, locks, and scraps of memory. The parlour quiets, the gifts are tucked away, and yet you are never truly alone. In Victorian America, the chaperone was as unavoidable as wallpaper, always hovering, always ready to remind you that romance was not a private affair, but a public performance with an audience. Imagine it. You lean slightly forward in your chair, and across the room a pair of spectacles glint. Aunt Gertrude again. Her knitting needles click like a metronome, perfectly timed to punctuate every pause in your conversation. She doesn't speak, she doesn't scold, but she doesn't have to. Her presence is a silent warning. One wrong move, and she'll report everything to the family tribunal. Here's the mainstream fact. In the 19th century, chaperonage was considered essential for unmarried women of respectable families. A young lady was rarely, if ever, allowed to meet a suitor without a mother, aunt, or older sibling present. This supervision was supposed to protect her virtue and reputation, but it also ensured that families maintained control over potential matches. Now for the quirky tidbit. Some families became so strict about chaperonage that they employed professional chaperones, women whose sole job was to accompany daughters on visits, strolls, or even shopping trips. Imagine your parents hiring someone whose 9 to 5 was to ruin your dates. That was a real career path. Historians still argue whether chaperones genuinely safeguarded young women or merely reinforced a culture of mistrust. Some argue they prevented real harm in an era when reputations were fragile. Others claim chaperones were instruments of control, ensuring that daughters never strayed from family-approved matches. The truth, as usual, is tangled somewhere in between. You picture the dance of it now. A couple sits close enough to share a glance, while the chaperone pretends to be absorbed in her embroidery. But is she really counting stitches? No, she's counting seconds. Too much laughter, too many glances, and suddenly the air grows thick with suspicion. Even in the park, remember, benches were monitored, strolls timed. The chaperone was everywhere, looming at balls, lingering in pews, perched in parlours. And yet human nature is inventive. Young lovers became experts in coded communication under watchful eyes. A dropped handkerchief might signal affection. A fan fluttered twice could mean yes. A book placed just so on the table whispered, "I'll wait." The chaperones saw only manners. The couple saw opportunity. Still, the constant presence could be suffocating. Imagine never once having a truly private word with someone you were expected to marry. How do you build intimacy under surveillance? That tension explains why stolen moments, an extra step behind on a walk, a whispered word while passing tea, felt like lightning bolts of freedom. When you live in a cage, even the smallest crack feels like the sky. You can't help laughing, though, at how modern dating would implode under this system. Picture swiping right, only for your date to show up with her mother, her aunt, and possibly her great-grandmother in tow. "Don't mind us," they'd say, knitting silently in the corner, while you order appetizers. That was Victorian romance in a nutshell. And so you shift again in your chair, the weight of eyes pressing from across the room. You speak carefully, laugh lightly, glance briefly, because the chaperone is always there, invisible walls made of lace and scrutiny. In this world, love wasn't just about hearts, it was about surviving the endless watch of propriety, one glance at a time. The knitting needles pause, the teacup rattles, and suddenly you realize something chilling. It isn't just the chaperones you need to worry about, it's everyone else. In Victorian America, gossip was as powerful as law, and one whispered remark at a sewing circle could carry more weight than anything written in the etiquette manuals. Picture it. You attend a Sunday service thinking only of your hymn book when two ladies in bonnets lean closer in the pew behind you. "Did you hear? He stayed in the parlour until 9 o'clock last Thursday." Their voices are soft, but the impact is thunderous. By dinner that evening, half the town has heard about your indiscretion, which was nothing more than lingering too long over tea. Here's the mainstream fact. Small communities in 19th century America relied heavily on reputation. Marriage prospects, business deals, and even friendships could rise or collapse based on public opinion. Courtship wasn't just about two people, it was a performance for the community, and gossip was the critic's review. Now for the quirky tidbit, newspapers occasionally published anonymous letters or society notes that slyly hinted at local romances. Imagine opening your morning paper to find a coy line like, "A certain young gentleman was seen loitering near Maple Street rather late last evening." Everyone knew who it meant, and suddenly your private walk was a public headline. Historians still argue whether gossip acted more as a protective force, discouraging dangerous behavior, or as a cruel weapon used to control and shame. Some scholars suggest it helped young women by discouraging unwanted advances, while others insist it stifled independence and forced conformity. Either way, its reach was impossible to escape. The sewing circles were the worst. Picture a group of women gathered with fabric and thread, seemingly occupied with stitching, but in reality sewing reputations together and tearing them apart. A single raised eyebrow, a muttered comment about someone's laugh being too free, and suddenly a young woman's chances at a respectable match could unravel like loose yarn. For young men, gossip could sting but rarely destroyed them. A clumsy dance step might spark a laugh, a flirtation with the wrong girl might bring a scolding, but men's reputations had more room to recover. For women, however, the stakes were lethal. A rumor of impropriety, even if false, could linger for years, hanging over every subsequent interaction like smoke from a smouldering fire. You feel it in your chest now, the paranoia of living under an invisible web of whispers. You can almost hear the creak of porch swings as neighbors lean forward to exchange notes on who walked with whom and for how long. A fleeting smile exchanged in church, proof of an engagement, a polite nod withheld at the market, evidence of heartbreak. The line between reality and rumor blurred until no one could tell them apart. Compared to today's gossip, likes on social media, blurry photos shared in group chats, this seems slower, almost quaint. But the effect was the same. Your private life was never truly private. Every move you made was documented, dissected, and retold in living rooms and parlors until your name took on a life of its own. So you sit once more beneath the watchful eyes of a community that pretends to be supportive, but thrives on speculation. You sip your tea carefully, knowing even that could be reported later. Because here, in Victorian America, it isn't just your sweetheart you're courting. It's every whisper in town, every glance across a sewing circle, every sly note in the local paper. The whispers fade, but the parlor conversation takes an even stranger turn. Someone at the gathering begins speaking of science, or what they believe is science. You lean closer, and suddenly you realize that in Victorian America, even the shape of your skull could determine whether you were deemed marriage material. Welcome to the curious world of phrenology. Imagine sitting in a chair while a specialist runs his fingers across the bumps on your head, murmuring things like, prominent benevolence, but slightly deficient in firmness. This wasn't a sideshow trick. It was once considered legitimate insight into your character, even your romantic suitability. Families sometimes invited phrenologists into parlors to assess whether a suitor's cranial ridges revealed a trustworthy nature or hinted at hidden vice. Here's your mainstream fact. Phrenology, developed in Europe in the early 19th century, gained traction in America by mid-century. Practitioners believed different regions of the brain controlled traits like affection, honesty, or ambition, and that skull shape reflected those traits. It seeped into courtship culture, with some families genuinely using it as a matchmaking tool. Now for the quirky tidbit. Phrenological charts often included zones labeled with qualities like amativeness, romantic desire, and conjugality, marital devotion. Imagine a mother inviting a traveling phrenologist into her home, only to hear him announce that a suitor had above-average amativeness. Talk about awkward family dinner conversation. Historians still argue whether most Americans took phrenology seriously or treated it more like party entertainment. Diaries and letters suggest both. Some couples truly believed it revealed destiny, while others laughed at its absurdity. Either way, its presence in Courtship shows just how desperate people were for tools to measure love in a world obsessed with control. You picture the scene. A nervous young man leans forward while the phrenologist pokes at his temples, declaring him steady in industriousness but weak in firmness. Across the room, the young woman's parents exchange meaningful looks. To them, this is as good as a credit check. Meanwhile, the young woman herself struggles not to giggle, secretly more impressed by the courage it takes to sit still under such scrutiny. And yet you can see the appeal. In a society where direct declarations of love were frowned upon, phrenology gave couples a loophole. A young lady could whisper to her friend, "His bump of affection was well developed," and everyone could nod approvingly. It was coded language disguised as science, a way to discuss attraction without scandal. Still, you can't help chuckling at how absurd it seems now. Imagine basing your dating profile on the circumference of your forehead. Likes long walks, dislikes poor cranial ridges. Yet in Victorian America, these ideas carried weight. Families sought certainty where none existed, and phrenology offered the illusion of order in the chaos of desire. You lean back in your stiff chair, realizing that in this world, even your skull wasn't safe from judgment. Every bump and ridge became a story, every contour another excuse to praise or condemn. Love wasn't just in the heart, it was mapped, charted, and measured on your very head. The phrenologist packs up his charts, the laughter dies down, and someone produces a slim, leather-bound book. It's an etiquette manual, and suddenly the room grows serious again, because in Victorian America, etiquette guides were not just handy suggestions, they were survival handbooks, moral compasses, and sometimes even weapons. You flip through the pages and find commands so detailed, they feel almost comical. When greeting a lady, bow slightly at the waist, but do not linger with your eyes. When conversing, never speak of yourself, for such vanity is unbecoming. Even how to sit was spelled out. A gentleman should never cross his legs in mixed company, lest he appear slovenly. Imagine needing an instruction manual just to move your knees. Here's your mainstream fact: by the mid to late 19th century, etiquette manuals sold by the thousands in America. Titles like The Lady's Book of Etiquette or Hints on Etiquette and the Usages of Society became household staples, especially for the middle class, eager to climb the social ladder. These books instructed young people in everything from dining manners to proper forms of courtship. Now, for the quirky tidbit, some manuals included entire sections on how to accept or reject a proposal with sample scripts. One even suggested a polite refusal should be written on blue paper to soften the blow. Imagine receiving a rejection letter color-coded for disappointment. Historians still argue whether these manuals reflected actual behavior or merely prescribed ideals. Did everyone really follow them, or were they more like aspirational self-help books? Evidence suggests many people tried, but reality often fell short. After all, farmers and factory workers couldn't always pause to calculate the perfect bow angle. Still, in parlours and drawing rooms, these books held enormous sway. You picture a young woman thumbing nervously through her copy, memorizing do's and don'ts before a visit. She might practice her smile in the mirror, making sure it conveyed warmth, but not forwardness. Meanwhile, her suitor rehearses the proper form of a compliment, avoiding any words that could seem too familiar. The manual has become their shared script, a third partner in every conversation. And yet there's irony here. In trying so hard to codify behavior, these guides often erased individuality. Everyone was supposed to laugh the same way, speak in the same tones, offer the same bland compliments. Courtship became less about two people discovering each other and more about two actors performing roles someone else had written. Of course, manuals also became comedy gold. Satirical newspapers loved mocking them, pointing out the absurdity of instructions like, "When introduced to a gentleman, do not ask after his health too eagerly, lest you appear intrusive." Imagine needing to calibrate your enthusiasm for someone's well-being with mathematical precision. Still, the manuals reveal something poignant: the fear of doing it wrong. In a society where gossip could ruin you, where families judged relentlessly, And where love itself was tangled in social contracts, people clung to these books like life rafts. They promised certainty in a world of uncertainty, even if that certainty was an illusion. So you close the leather-bound cover, hearing the faint snap of the spine, and realize that every gesture, every word, every glance is governed not just by parents or gossip, but by ink on a page. The etiquette manual doesn't just sit on the table, it sits in your head, whispering rules into your every move. The etiquette book snaps shut, but not everyone lived in houses large enough for best parlours and velvet curtains. You step into a boarding house now where walls are thin, rooms are cramped, and romance has to navigate an entirely different maze of restrictions. Here, the rules of courtship don't vanish, they multiply. Boarding houses were common in Victorian-era America, especially in growing cities. Young men and women who left farms for work in factories, shops or offices often couldn't afford private apartments. Instead, they rented small rooms in shared houses where meals, chores and sometimes even laundry were communal. The result? Courtship played out in hallways, stairwells and dining rooms with everyone watching. Here's your mainstream fact. Boarding houses became hotbeds of social life in the 19th century. Advertisements even promised respectable company as a selling point, and many had rules specifically about conduct between male and female tenants. Landladies, who often ran these establishments, acted as unofficial chaperones, ensuring no impropriety occurred under their roof. Now for the quirky tidbit. Some boarding houses literally rang bells to announce visiting hours were over, like a school recess ending. If a gentleman lingered past the bell, he risked both gossip and eviction. Imagine today's landlord barging into your date and saying, "Time's up, out you go." Historians still argue whether boarding houses gave young people more freedom or less. On one hand, living in the city provided opportunities for new connections outside family oversight. On the other, the constant presence of housemates and a watchful landlady meant privacy was still a fantasy. Diaries describe whispered conversations on staircases, eyes darting nervously to see if anyone was eavesdropping. You imagine a young couple meeting at the communal dinner table. She pours tea carefully while he cracks a small joke about the stew. Every glance feels like a gamble because 10 other boarders are in the room, forks clattering, ears pricking for any whiff of scandal. Later, maybe they linger a moment too long on the staircase, words hushed, shoulders nearly touching, but never quite. The creak of a floorboard is enough to send them scattering like startled cats. Compared to the grandeur of parlours, boarding house romance feels almost raw, stripped of chandeliers and etiquette manuals. Yet the rules are no less suffocating. Instead of velvet curtains, it's the gossip of fellow tenants. Instead of mothers and aunts, it's the landlady's raised eyebrow. Privacy was so rare that even a smile exchanged while washing dishes could set tongues wagging. But there was also opportunity. In cities, young people encountered a wider range of partners than they ever would have in small towns. Boarding houses mixed clerks, seamstresses, salesmen, and teachers, people who might never have crossed paths otherwise. Some romances flourished even under the gaze of 50 curious eyes. Others fizzled, smothered by constant surveillance and too many ears listening at doors. Think about it. Modern dating apps feel private, but imagine if every swipe and message were projected on the walls of your apartment building. That was life in a boarding house. No secrets, only performances. And yet, when you picture the narrow staircases and dim hallways, you can almost see how thrilling it must have been. To exchange even a few whispered words in a corner was to defy an entire building. To slip a note under a door was to risk exposure, but also to taste rebellion. Love, here, didn't grow in grand gestures. It survived in small sparks, hidden beneath the everyday noise of communal life. The boarding house fades behind you, and soon church bells toll in the distance. In Victorian America, Sunday wasn't just about sermons and hymns, it was a central stage for courtship. Religion and romance intertwined, sometimes harmoniously, sometimes with awkward friction, but always under the gaze of a community that believed faith and family were inseparable. You enter the church, the air smelling faintly of wax and pine from freshly scrubbed pews. Families file in, dressed in their finest. For young men and women, Sunday service was as much about being seen as it was about worship. A well-timed glance during the hymn, a subtle adjustment of a bonnet ribbon, even the way someone held their prayer book, all became signals in this weekly theatre of matchmaking. Here's the mainstream fact. Churches were the primary meeting grounds for many Victorian Americans. Weekly attendance wasn't optional, it was expected. Courtships often began in pews, with introductions arranged by ministers or encouraged by families who sat strategically close to each other. After service, Sunday strolls offered more chances for conversation, often under the thin veil of religious propriety. Now for the quirky tidbit, some churches actually assigned pews based on family contributions or status. That meant your seating arrangement could broadcast your wealth and influence. In other words, your romantic opportunities might be shaped by where exactly your family plopped down each week. Front pews meant prominence. Back pews sometimes hinted at lesser means, or occasionally scandal. Historians still argue whether church functioned more as a genuine space for spiritual community or as an unofficial marriage market. Diaries from the period hint at both. One young woman noted she prayed with her lips, but watched with her eyes, scanning the congregation for eligible bachelors. Others complained that sermons were often drowned out by whispered evaluations of hats and waistcoats. You picture it now, a young man singing a little too loudly, hoping to show off his devotion and maybe his baritone. A young woman carefully arranging her hymn book so that a pressed flower peeks out, a subtle invitation for curiosity. The sermon may drone on, but the energy between pews hums with possibility. And when service ends, the true ritual begins, the Sunday walk. Couples drift outside, often under the watch of mothers and ministers, strolling down leafy lanes or circling churchyards. The beauty of the walk was its innocence. It was sanctioned by religion, yet it gave couples the chance for small, meaningful exchanges. A question about the sermon might lead to laughter about the preacher's long-windedness. A compliment on a bonnet ribbon might really mean, "I noticed you." Of course, the church community kept score. A peer too attentive, and gossip swelled. They walked home together again this week. Surely an engagement is near. A peer too indifferent, and questions arose. Why has he not called upon her after so many strolls? Every step between pew and gate was observed, weighed, and discussed over Sunday dinners across town. Compared to the rigid parlour, church offered a strange balance of freedom and surveillance. You could exchange more words, walk a little closer, even laugh, so long as it was under the halo of piety. Anything too bold, though, and whispers would follow faster than the echo of the bell tower. So you stroll down the church path now, gravel crunching beneath your boots, the sermon still ringing faintly in your ears. Around you, couples form and dissolve like shifting clouds. Some will lead to marriages blessed from the pulpit. Others will end as faint memories of a bonnet glimpsed across a pew. Either way, religion has set the stage, weaving faith and flirtation into a single, unavoidable ritual. The Sunday stroll fades into memory, but the next stage of courtship looms larger and heavier, the proposal. Forget the modern idea of slipping a ring onto a finger in a romantic flash of spontaneity. In Victorian America, proposals were often negotiations, tangled in family expectations, financial concerns, and property calculations. Love was part of the equation, but rarely the whole sum. Picture it, you're seated in the parlour again, palms sweaty, hat on your lap. Across from you sits not just the woman you hope to marry, but her parents, possibly her brothers, maybe even an uncle or two. This is less candlelit romance and more boardroom meeting. Your words must prove devotion, yes, but also stability. Can you support her? Do you own land? Do you have prospects? Your declaration of love might be heartfelt, but unless it comes packaged with a plan, it risks being dismissed as youthful folly. Here's your mainstream fact. In 19th century America, engagement was a serious contract, almost as binding as marriage itself. Breaking one carried social consequences akin to scandal, especially for women, who could be branded as undesirable afterward. Families therefore scrutinize proposals carefully before allowing an engagement to be announced. Now for the quirky tidbit. Some etiquette manuals suggested that proposals should be rehearsed in advance. Yes, literally practiced like a speech. One guide even warned against kneeling if the floor was uncarpeted, lest the moment seem undignified. Imagine turning down a suitor not because of his words, but because he scuffed his trousers on bare wood. Historians still argue whether proposals were more about love or economics. Diaries reveal genuine affection, but correspondence between families often focused on money, land, and alliances. The romance of "Will you marry me?" was often accompanied by a silent second question, "And will your family's resources strengthen ours?" You can almost feel the tension in the room. A young man declares his intentions with trembling sincerity. The young woman, coached by her mother, responds with grace but hesitation, for it isn't only her heart on the line. It's her reputation, her family's name, even their future stability. She might adore him, but if his farm is too small or his prospects too uncertain, the match could be deemed impractical. And sometimes conditions were placed. "We consent," a father might say, "provided you finish your studies first, or provided you secure steady work." Engagements could stretch for months or even years, suspended like contracts pending signatures. In some cases, women accepted proposals but kept them secret until families approved, creating a strange limbo where affection thrived in whispers but could not be publicly acknowledged. You chuckle thinking of modern comparisons. Imagine if your engagement announcement came with footnotes, legal clauses, and a waiting period like a software license. That's what it felt like: marriage as merger, hearts as collateral. Yet within this framework, romance still flickered. Couples found ways to make the moment theirs, exchanging tokens, pressing hands beneath the table, sneaking an extra glance while families negotiated. Love adapted, as it always does, squeezing itself into the cracks between contracts and conditions. And so you sit there, watching as the young man rehearses his courage, the young woman balances her heart against her duty, and the parents weigh every syllable like coins on a scale. In Victorian America, a proposal wasn't just a question. It was a transaction dressed in poetry, a binding promise that tethered not just two people, but two families for life. The proposal is accepted, or perhaps not. Either way, the next chapter of Courtship reveals just how fragile the Victorian system could be. Engagements weren't casual promises, they were binding contracts in the eyes of society, and when they broke, the fallout could shake entire families. You picture the scene: a young woman sits at her writing desk, candlelight flickering on her pale face. She holds a letter in trembling hands, the ink already blurred by tears. Her fiancé has withdrawn, maybe for financial reasons, maybe because of gossip, maybe simply because his family disapproves. To us, it sounds like a sad but survivable breakup. But in Victorian America, a broken engagement could scar her reputation for life. Here's your mainstream fact: lawsuits over broken engagements were surprisingly common in the 19th century. Known as breach of promise cases, these lawsuits allowed jilted brides-to-be to sue their former fiancés for damages. Courts sometimes awarded large sums, reasoning that a woman's reputation and marriage prospects had been irreparably harmed by a public rejection. Now for the quirky tidbit: in some sensational cases, women actually displayed their ex-fiancés' love letters in court as evidence. Imagine having your mushiest lines about roses and devotion read aloud to a jury, preserved forever in legal records. Not exactly the legacy most lovers hoped for. Historians still argue whether these lawsuits empowered women or reinforced patriarchal norms. Some say they gave women leverage in a society where they had few legal rights. Others argue they reduced women's worth to marriageability, making rejection not just an emotional wound, but a financial liability. You can almost feel the tension in those parlors where engagements dissolved. A father storms about the room, muttering about dishonor. A mother wrings her hands, fearing the whispers that will spread across the sewing circle. And the young woman, caught in the storm, knows she may forever be branded the girl who was left behind. Her chances at another match diminish with every retelling. For men, broken engagements carried fewer consequences, though their reputations could still suffer. A man who gained a reputation for jilting women might find doors closed in respectable circles. Still, the burden of shame weighed much heavier on women, who were expected to guard their reputations like fragile glass. Sometimes families worked to cover the scandal. Engagements were quietly postponed until they simply faded from memory. In other cases, they spun narratives to place blame elsewhere. Ill health or unexpected travel provided convenient alibis. But gossip usually pierced these veils. Communities thrived on stories, and a broken engagement was too juicy to ignore. You laugh softly, thinking of modern breakups, awkward texts, returned hoodies, maybe a blocked number. By comparison, Victorian endings were operatic. Lawsuits, public testimony, ruined reputations, even family feuds that lasted for decades. Courtship was high stakes, and failure was treated as near catastrophe. So you sit in the parlour once more, listening to the whispers of shame, the creak of rocking chairs, the rustle of torn letters tossed into the fire. Engagements were meant to be unshakable foundations, but when they cracked, the collapse echoed loudly across every pew, parlour, and newspaper column in town. The ashes of torn letters still glow faintly in the grate, but the world outside is already changing. Telegraph wires hum overhead, strung across the American landscape like veins carrying jolts of electricity. And into this network of sparks slips something new: love notes transmitted by dots and dashes. Yes, the telegraph, faster than letters, riskier than whispers, and somehow both thrilling and absurd. Imagine sitting in a telegraph office, nervously dictating your feelings to an operator who then taps them out to another operator miles away. That stranger translates your deepest emotions into code, sends them across copper wires, and then someone else deciphers them at the other end before handing them over. Privacy? Practically none. Speed? Revolutionary. Here's your mainstream fact. By the 1850s, the telegraph was transforming communication in America. It allowed information to travel in minutes rather than days. While mostly used for business and news, it inevitably crept into the realm of personal relationships, including courtship. Now for the quirky tidbit. Lovers sometimes developed private ciphers within telegraph code, slipping in secret meanings only they understood. One couple, for example, used the length of pauses between words as signals. An extra long pause meant, "I miss you." Imagine pouring your heart out through carefully timed silences in Morse code. Historians still argue whether telegraph courtship was actually common or mostly anecdotal. Some insist it was rare, limited to the wealthy or those with access to telegraph offices. Others suggest it represented a genuine shift, an early precursor to the instant messages and late-night texts we take for granted today. Either way, it fascinates scholars as an early fusion of technology and romance. Picture it now. A young man, too impatient to wait for the post, hurries to the telegraph office. His message is short. Brevity was crucial since every word cost money. "Thinking of you, stop, hope to see you Sunday, stop." On the receiving end, a young woman blushes as she reads, though her mother frowns at the extravagance of spending good money on sentiment. And then the drama of interception. Telegraph operators, bored after hours of transmitting business transactions, often peeked at personal messages. They became accidental voyeurs of romance, smirking at love notes, sometimes even gossiping about them. Imagine your text messages being read aloud in the break room by random strangers. That was the risk of Victorian high-speed love. Still, the thrill was undeniable. For couples separated by distance, soldiers, travelling salesmen, or students at faraway universities, the telegraph offered a lifeline. A dot-dash good night felt miraculous when you were used to waiting weeks for a letter. It shrank the space between hearts, even as it introduced new kinds of vulnerability. You lean against the counter, listening to the clatter of the telegraph key, marveling at how romance adapts to every tool it finds. Where once it lived in parlours, parks and pews, now it flickers through copper wires compressed into code rushed across landscapes delivered with a click and a pause. It's funny to think, in a way, Victorians were the first to experience the anxiety of instant messaging. Did she receive it? Why hasn't she replied? Was my message too short, too abrupt, too costly? The concerns are timeless, only the medium has changed. And so the sparks of love stretch along the wires, a strange new rhythm in the dance of courtship. What once took days now takes minutes, and with each pulse of electricity, romance is reshaped, faster, riskier, but no less fraught with rules. The sharp clicks of the telegraph fade, replaced by the hurried clatter of carriage wheels in the night. Not every couple was willing to endure the suffocating rules of parlours, church pews, and gossiping sewing circles. For some, the only answer was escape, elopement, the ultimate scandal, and the boldest declaration of love in Victorian America. Picture it, two figures slipping out of a darkened house, her skirts gathered in trembling hands, his boots silent on the gravel. A hired carriage waits at the edge of town, its driver paid well to keep his mouth shut. The couple climbs in, hearts hammering, knowing that by dawn they might be married or ruined. Elopement wasn't just running away together, it was leaping headlong over the walls of propriety. Here's your mainstream fact. Elopements were common enough in the 19th century that newspapers frequently reported them, often with a mix of scandal and amusement. Some states, like Kentucky, even became notorious for runaway marriages, drawing couples from stricter regions who wanted quick ceremonies without parental consent. And, the quirky tidbit, in some cases couples literally crossed state lines to marry under looser laws, creating what historians sometimes call marriage tourism. One town in Indiana was so famous for its elopements that hotels advertised bridal packages for runaway lovers. Imagine turning elopement into a tourist industry, romance as both rebellion and business. Historians still argue whether most elopements were acts of passion or desperation. Some were fueled by genuine love, young couples unwilling to wait for parental approval. Others were driven by necessity, pregnancies that needed legitimizing, financial arrangements gone awry, or the iron grip of families who disapproved of a match. Either way, the act carried immense risk, because once discovered, elopements sent shockwaves through communities. Families often felt dishonored, reputations were tarnished, and gossip spread like wildfire. A young woman might be branded reckless, even immoral, while the man was painted as selfish or manipulative. And yet in certain circles, the very scandal added a romantic sheen. Two lovers so devoted they defied the world. You can almost hear the hushed tones in parlours the next morning. "Did you hear? She ran away with that schoolteacher." Gasps, whispers, hands clutching pearls. Some families disowned their children over elopements, while others, after the heat of scandal cooled, quietly welcomed the couple back, too weary to fight the tide of fate. And think of the couples themselves, huddled in a carriage, torn between fear and exhilaration. Every mile carried them further from disapproval, closer to freedom, or disaster. The clop of hooves became the drumbeat of their rebellion, each turn in the road a chance to reconsider, but they pressed on, clutching hands in the dark, fueled by a mixture of terror, joy, and defiance. Compared to today, it's almost theatrical. Now, elopement often means a secret flight to Vegas, neon lights, and Elvis impersonators officiating. Back then, it meant real peril, angry fathers, armed brothers, reputations shredded in church pews. It was less romantic getaway and more social detonation. And yet, beneath all the risk, there was a strange beauty. To elope was to choose love over rule books, to tear away from gossip's grip, to carve out a future without asking permission. In a society obsessed with control, it was the purest act of defiance. So you sit in the rattling carriage now, lamplight flickering through the window, the night air sharp with the scent of horses and dust. Ahead lies uncertainty, scandal, maybe even ruin, but also the intoxicating possibility of a love lived freely, if only for the briefest of moments. The carriage wheels roll out of earshot, but not every couple had the nerve or the recklessness to elope. For those who stayed behind, there was another curious outlet for romance: the printed page. You glance at a newspaper from the 1870s and, tucked between reports of harvests and politics, you spot something odd: matrimonial ads. Yes, people literally advertised for spouses in the press. Imagine the scene: a widower in Ohio, weary of loneliness, drafts a notice for the local paper. Respectable gentleman of 30 seeks a lady of sound character and good disposition. Meanwhile, a woman in Pennsylvania pens her own line. Young widow, fond of music and domestic life, seeks a partner of industrious habits. These were less love notes and more resumes for matrimony. Here's your mainstream fact: by the mid-19th century, matrimonial advertisements had become common in American newspapers. They reflected a society where mobility, urban growth, and westward expansion separated people from traditional matchmaking networks. Ads provided a new, if risky, way to connect. Now, for the quirky tidbit, some papers sold entire columns of Lonely Hearts notices, and editors occasionally poked fun at them. One cheeky publication even printed an ad reading, "Gentleman with wooden leg desires wife with sewing machine." It was satire, of course, but it highlighted how bizarre the practice seemed to some contemporaries. Historians still argue whether these ads represented genuine opportunities or dangerous traps. Some were earnest, leading to real marriages. Others were scams, with con artists exploiting hopeful readers. Diaries and letters suggest both outcomes existed. Some couples lived happily ever after, while others ended up in court, accusing each other of fraud. Picture it now: a young woman reading an ad in secret, her cheeks flushing as she wonders if replying would be scandalous. She knows her family would disapprove. Answering a stranger through print could seem reckless, but the idea tempts her anyway. Across town, a man at his desk imagines the faceless woman who might respond to his carefully worded plea. Their courtship begins not with glances across a parlor, but with ink, envelopes, and the thrill of possibility. The ads weren't always vague. Some suitors specified height, weight, even preferred eye color. Others focused on finances, bluntly stating they wanted wives who could contribute property. Love in this strange marketplace was filtered through blunt practicality. You could almost call it the Victorian version of swiping left or right, only much slower and far more expensive. And of course, gossip found its way here too. Couples who admitted they'd met through ads often faced ridicule, accused of desperation or poor judgment. Yet the practice persisted precisely because it worked for some. When distance, class, or circumstance kept traditional courtship out of reach, the newspaper opened doors that parlors could not. You smile at the irony. The very society obsessed with propriety was also quietly experimenting with something startlingly modern. Matrimonial ads turned the private longing for companionship into public negotiation, visible for anyone with a few cents to spend on a paper. So you fold the newspaper, the ink smudging your fingers, and realize that in Victorian America, love wasn't confined to parlors, strolls, or even carriages in the night. Sometimes it was printed in black and white, waiting for a stranger to take a chance. You fold the newspaper and slip it aside, only to notice another innovation shaping the way love was remembered: the photograph. Before long, daguerreotypes and later cartes de visite became tokens of affection, proof of presence, and sometimes the only keepsake lovers had when distance stretched too far. Picture the ritual. A young man sits stiffly in a studio, chin tilted awkwardly upward, as the photographer barks orders, "Hold still, don't blink." The exposure takes long seconds, long enough for his polite smile to wobble into something more like discomfort. But when the photograph is finished, it is carefully framed, tucked into a locket, or even mailed across miles as though it were a fragment of himself. Here's the mainstream fact: by the 1840s and 1850s, photography spread rapidly across America. Daguerreotypes, small, mirrored images sealed in cases, were among the earliest forms. By the 1860s, cartes de visite, small paper prints mounted on cards, became popular and inexpensive. Lovers exchanged them eagerly, often inscribing notes on the backs. Now for the quirky tidbit. Some couples secretly swapped photographs hidden inside books or wrapped in handkerchiefs away from parental eyes. Others went further. Studio photographers sometimes staged romantic scenes with couples pretending to read together or gaze wistfully into the distance. Imagine paying extra for a Victorian couple selfie, staged under hot lamps, complete with lace curtains and cardboard props. Historians still argue whether photography democratized love tokens or reinforced class divides. On one hand, photos became cheaper over time, accessible even to working families. On the other, the wealthiest couples could commission elaborate portraits, hand-tinted with color, making their romances look more glamorous than reality. You imagine a young woman receiving a daguerreotype case in the mail. She opens it with trembling hands, sees the faint, silvery image of her beau, and feels her heart leap. She can't hold him, but she can trace the lines of his face with her eyes. She might even sleep with it beside her pillow, the cool glass pressing against her cheek as though it contained warmth. But photographs weren't always flattering. Long exposures meant stiff poses, and people sometimes looked more like wax figures than living beings. Couples joked about how their sweethearts appeared grim or melancholy in portraits, though the affection behind the image mattered more than the expression. And of course, photos could carry scandal. A woman found with a man's portrait tucked into her prayer book might be accused of impropriety. Families kept sharp eyes out for such tokens, confiscating them if discovered. Yet somehow the photograph survived, hidden in sewing baskets, pressed between Bible pages, slipped beneath mattresses. The desire to keep a tangible reminder of love was too strong for propriety to fully smother. Think of it compared to today. Instead of swiping through digital selfies, Victorians treasured one fragile photo, darkened around the edges, its case worn smooth from years of being handled. That single image carried more weight than 1,000 filtered pictures do now. So you place the daguerreotype carefully on the mantel, its silvery surface catching the glow of the lamp. It is heavy in its little case, heavy with unspoken promises, heavy with the knowledge that in an age of fleeting words and rigid rules, a photograph could whisper the one thing no etiquette manual dared put into ink: I am yours. The photograph fades from your hands, but you soon notice something even heavier in the air: the invisible walls of class. Victorian America, for all its talk of virtue and romance, drew hard lines between who could court whom. Love may have been blind, but society was not. It saw everything, and it never stopped judging. Imagine a farmer's daughter stealing a glance at a merchant's son during Sunday service. Their smiles meet for half a second, and already the whispers begin. She's reaching above her station. Or a wealthy young lady notices the charm of a factory foreman, only to be told sternly by her parents that such men are not suitable material. The boundary wasn't just about money, it was about education, manners, and family name. Here's the mainstream fact: class divisions in 19th century America were stark. The industrial boom created new wealth, but also reinforced hierarchies. Middle and upper-class families guarded their daughters fiercely, determined that marriages should maintain or elevate their standing. A wealthy match was celebrated as prudence, a poor one was branded recklessness. Now, for the quirky tidbit, some etiquette manuals even warned against marrying too far above, as well as too far below. One guide insisted that a woman marrying a man of much higher rank might be doomed to perpetual humiliation, forever reminded of her humble origins. In other words, climbing the ladder could be just as risky as slipping down it. Historians still argue whether these class lines were truly rigid or if love sometimes bent them. Evidence exists for both. Some diaries describe couples who defied expectations, marrying across divides and building lives together, despite family disapproval. But just as many letters reveal broken romances crushed under the weight of financial pressure and parental veto. You picture the contradictions. A middle-class girl might long for a wealthy suitor, but fear being labelled a fortune hunter. A working-class man might adore a refined young lady, but know he could never provide the standard of living her family expected. Every affection had to be weighed against ledgers, as if love itself needed a balance sheet. And class wasn't always obvious. New money complicated the game. A successful merchant might be richer than an old family landowner, but without the right pedigree, his children could still face rejection. Respectability, it turned out, was as much about ancestry as it was about bank accounts. Even in small towns where everyone knew each other's families, class rules seeped in. A girl from a modest household might find herself overlooked at dances, not because of her smile, but because of the plain fabric of her dress. Meanwhile, a boy with fine boots and polished manners could win approval before he even opened his mouth. It's not so different today, you think, though now the markers are subtler: college degrees, career choices, or zip codes instead of ribbons and land deeds. The same invisible walls still stand, just dressed in modern clothing. So you lean back, watching as couples attempt to bridge gaps they aren't supposed to cross. Some succeed, fueled by defiance and luck. Others falter, realizing that in Victorian America, love was never just about hearts. It was also about ledgers, pedigrees, and the unyielding gaze of class. The invisible wall of class still looms behind you, but now the landscape shifts. Imagine leaving the city for a barn dance beneath lanterns, or stepping back into an urban parlor heavy with velvet. Rural and urban dating followed the same basic script: rules, supervision, gossip. But each had its own flavor, its own peculiar traps and freedoms. In the countryside, the community was tight-knit. A barn dance might bring together everyone within a 10-mile radius, fiddles scraping out jigs while boots stomped on wooden floors dusted with hay. Young men and women could mingle more freely here than in a stiff parlor, but freedom came at a price. Everyone knew everyone else, and gossip spread even faster across farm fields than through city streets. A single, lingering glance on the dance floor could be reported by morning to half the county. Here's your mainstream fact. Rural America in the 19th century often centered its social life on communal gatherings like barn dances, quilting bees, and church socials. These were essential courtship venues, giving young people opportunities to meet in environments sanctioned by community tradition. Now for the quirky tidbit: at some barn dances, partners were chosen by drawing names from a hat, or even by tossing apples and pairing whoever caught them. It sounds like a game, and it was. But beneath the laughter, couples sometimes used the randomness as an excuse to spend time together without blame. The apple made me do it, after all, was a safer alibi than outright choosing. In cities, meanwhile, courtship had its own stage. Parlors were more elaborate, etiquette manuals more strictly enforced, and competition fiercer. Dance halls, theatres, and promenades along carefully designed city parks all offered opportunities for couples to mingle. But the density of urban life meant reputations could rise or fall in a single evening. One poorly judged joke at a soirée might trail you through a dozen drawing rooms. Historians still argue which environment gave couples more freedom. Rural gatherings allowed looser behavior, laughter, dancing, even the occasional unchaperoned walk home along dark country lanes. But they also offered no anonymity. If you misbehaved, your neighbors and their children, cousins and cows would all know by sunrise. Urban life, in contrast, offered more anonymity but harsher rules. Break one, and you risked exile from fashionable circles. You picture both worlds now. In a barn lit with lanterns, couples spin in dizzy circles, skirts brushing against trousers, the air smelling of hay and cider. Outside, crickets sing while two figures linger by the fence, whispering. In a city ballroom, chandeliers blaze, gloves squeak against satin, and whispers of approval or disapproval ripple like invisible threads across the crowd. And yet, whether in a barn or a parlor, the same paradox hums beneath the surface. Couples yearn for connection, but every step is choreographed by watchful eyes. The fiddle tune may be looser, the orchestra stricter, but the dance is still the same, an endless balancing act between desire and decorum. You smile at the thought, whether under hayloft beams or gilded ceilings, love in Victorian America was never simple. It just wore different costumes depending on where you happened to live. The fiddle tune fades and the chatter of the parlor quiet in, but something darker lingers beneath it all, the barrier of race. In Victorian-era America, courtship wasn't simply shaped by class or geography. It was constrained by the rigid, often brutal rules of segregation and prejudice. Who you were allowed to love and who you were forbidden even to glance at depended heavily on skin color and ancestry. Imagine a young black man in the 1870s working in a city where his wages put him in daily contact with white families. He might admire a young woman across the street, but even the faintest hint of affection between them could provoke outrage, violence, or worse. In many places, laws explicitly criminalized interracial relationships, branding them immoral or illegal. Courtship was not just discouraged, it was dangerous. Here's your mainstream fact. Throughout the 19th century, many American states enforced anti-miscegenation laws banning marriages between white people and people of color. These laws, rooted in slavery and white supremacy, persisted well into the 20th century. In Victorian America, they shaped not only legal options but the very boundaries of who could be considered a potential partner. Now for the quirky tidbit. In some northern cities, newspapers reported sensational, forbidden romances across racial lines, treating them as scandalous curiosities. These stories often read like morality tales, but occasionally they revealed quiet defiance, couples who risked everything to be together. Imagine reading a column in 1880 about a runaway marriage, written with shock but tinged with fascination, as though love itself were an exotic crime. Historians still argue whether interracial relationships were rare because of genuine social consensus or because fear suppressed them into secrecy. Letters and court records suggest they did happen more often than the dominant narrative admits, but were hidden, silenced, or punished harshly. The truth is layered, like so much of Victorian life, more complex than the stiff etiquette manuals allow. You picture it now, a boarding house staircase where two young people of different races pass each other, eyes meeting briefly. That glance alone could spark whispers, could risk their livelihoods, even their safety. And yet human hearts don't always obey the law. In diaries tucked away, in stories whispered long after, you find evidence of these small rebellions, these flickers of courage. Meanwhile, white couples navigated rules that felt suffocating but survivable. Too many glances in the parlor, too much laughter in the park. For interracial couples, the stakes weren't whispers. They were exile, violence, or legal prosecution. A single moment of tenderness could mean life or death. And still, some dared. A young black woman might keep a photograph of her white sweetheart hidden deep in a sewing box. A native man and a white woman might exchange tokens by a riverside, knowing discovery would tear them apart. The rules of Victorian America were not just strange, they were cruel, carving boundaries across the most intimate parts of life. Compared to today, where challenges still exist but laws have changed, you realize how suffocating those walls must have felt. Love that crossed class lines risked gossip. Love that crossed racial lines risked everything. So you stand at the edge of that world, hearing the silence where laughter should be, seeing the glances swallowed before they could bloom into words. Victorian courtship was never equal, and for many it was never safe. The rules weren't merely about manners, they were about exclusion, about who was deemed worthy of love and who was denied it altogether. The silence around race lingers, but another voice intrudes, the doctors. In Victorian America, medical authority carried enormous weight, and it seeped into courtship in peculiar ways. Love wasn't just bound by propriety and class, it was monitored by physicians, warning that too much passion might damage your delicate constitution. Picture a nervous mother consulting a family doctor about her daughter's courtship habits. She grows flushed when she walks with him, the mother frets. The doctor nods gravely, perhaps suggesting more rest, less excitement, fewer strolls in the evening air. Suddenly, what we'd call falling in love is reclassified as a medical concern. Here's the mainstream fact. 19th century medicine often described women as inherently fragile, with limited nervous energy. Doctors warned that intense emotions, especially romantic ones, could destabilize a young woman's health, leading to fainting, hysteria, or long-term weakness. Men were cautioned too, though usually with less alarm, urged to avoid excesses that might sap vitality. Now for the quirky tidbit, some physicians claimed that reading too many sentimental novels could overstimulate a young woman's imagination, leaving her prone to fainting spells or dangerous excitability. Imagine your doctor prescribing less Jane Austen to keep your blood pressure steady. Historians still argue whether these medical warnings were sincerely believed or whether they were tools of social control, reinforcing the idea that women needed constant supervision. Some evidence suggests families truly feared for their daughters' health. Other accounts reveal young women rolling their eyes at yet another lecture about the dangers of blushing too hard. You imagine the absurdity of it now. A couple sits together in the parlor speaking softly about poetry. The young woman laughs a little too warmly and her mother rushes to fetch smelling salts, convinced romance itself might trigger a collapse. Doctors fueled this paranoia by publishing treatises warning against undue stimulation of the female nerves. And it wasn't just women. Young men were warned about the dangers of overexertion, physical or romantic. Too much dancing, too many late nights, or even excessive kissing, should it somehow occur under watchful eyes, could supposedly weaken their stamina and shorten their lives. In some manuals, passion was treated almost like an illness, a fever that had to be contained. Compared to modern dating advice, text back promptly, don't ghost. Victorian medical guidance sounds almost comical, yet its effect was real. Families used these warnings to justify tighter rules, stricter chaperonage, and shorter visits. Love wasn't simply risky to reputation, it was bizarrely branded risky to health. Still, couples adapted. If passion was a disease, they embraced it quietly. A flushed cheek, a racing pulse, a trembling hand, all these signs of attraction became both thrilling and dangerous, evidence of affection and, to anxious parents, symptoms of fragility. The body itself became a battlefield where love and medicine clashed. So you sit again in the stiff chair, watching as the young woman's laughter trails off, her mother eyeing her nervously, a vial of smelling salts hidden in her pocket. Courtship here isn't just about propriety or class, it's about surviving the scrutiny of doctors who believed too much love could make you sick. The doctor's warnings fade, but another imbalance remains impossible to ignore: the double standards of gender. In Victorian America, men and women played by different rule books, and the consequences of breaking those rules could not have been more uneven. Picture a young man boasting to his friends at the tavern about a flirtation at last week's ball. His companions laugh, clap him on the back, and pour another drink. Now picture the young woman from that same ball, accused of laughing too freely with two partners in one evening. Her name is whispered with suspicion in sewing circles, her reputation already crumbling. The same behavior, admired in him, condemned in her. Here's your mainstream fact. The 19th century cemented a cultural ideal known as the cult of true womanhood. Women were expected to embody purity, piety, submissiveness, and domesticity. Men, meanwhile, were often excused for boldness, even encouraged to display passion or ambition. This imbalance shaped every corner of courtship. Now for the quirky tidbit: etiquette manuals sometimes advised women never to initiate conversation with men, yet simultaneously scolded them for seeming dull or unengaging. In other words, women had to be charming, but not forward, witty, but never too outspoken. It was like being told to win a game while never moving your pieces. Historians still argue whether women found ways to subvert these rules or whether they were truly trapped by them. Diaries reveal both patterns. Some women played the system with skill, using subtle humor, coded gestures, or carefully controlled mistakes to hint at interest. Others wrote of feeling suffocated, judged at every turn, unable to escape reputations built on the flimsiest pretexts. The hypocrisy ran deep. A man who flirted with multiple women might be described as sociable or adventurous. A woman who entertained more than one suitor could be labeled shameless. Men who postponed marriage to pursue education or careers were praised for their ambition. Women who delayed marriage risked being branded spinsters, and when scandal struck, the divide widened further. A man caught in a romantic indiscretion might suffer some gossip, but often recovered quickly. A woman caught in the same situation might see her entire future destroyed. Love was not merely uneven, it was rigged. You can almost hear the contradictions rattling through a parlor conversation. A mother warns her daughter, "Do not speak too much," while simultaneously urging her, "Make sure you seem agreeable." A father praises his son's boldness at a dance, then frowns when a young lady dares to smile too brightly. Every expectation leaned in one direction, every punishment in another. It's hard not to laugh at the absurdity while feeling the weight of it. Imagine playing chess where your opponent can move all the pieces freely, while you are restricted to pawns and every move you make is criticized no matter what. That was Victorian dating for women. And yet, despite the unfairness, many women found ways to carve out agency. Through letters, through coded tokens, through friendships with sympathetic chaperones, they bent rules where they could. Love still bloomed, awkwardly, unevenly, but stubbornly, despite the stacked deck. So you sit back, watching as men and women waltz through a ballroom bound by invisible strings. His steps are judged as daring, hers as dangerous. The music plays on, but the dance floor tilts steeply in one direction, and only the boldest women dare to balance on its uneven surface. The dance floor tilts beneath you, but time itself begins to shift. You feel the hum of trains rattling across new tracks, novels slipping from printing presses, cities swelling with industry. Slowly, the suffocating corset of courtship begins to loosen. The late Victorian years bring cracks in the rules, small but undeniable, as young people seize new ways to meet and mingle. Railroads first. What once took days by carriage can now be crossed in hours. A young man can visit a sweetheart in another town without vanishing for weeks. Lovers, separated by geography, now trade letters and then, astonishingly, reunite in person more quickly than their parents ever dreamed. Courtship, though still bound by etiquette, becomes faster, more mobile, less rooted in a single parlour. Here's your mainstream fact. By the 1870s and 1880s, railroads connected nearly every corner of America. This mobility reshaped relationships, not just in terms of travel, but also in exposure. Young people who once only met neighbours now encountered strangers at stations, hotels, or social events in far-off towns. Now for the quirky tidbit. Some couples deliberately scheduled chance meetings at railway depots, where a quick hello seemed innocent, but carried sparks. Diaries even record flirtations scribbled onto scraps of ticket stubs, tokens slipped between the pages of timetables. Imagine treating Amtrak like Tinder, but with more soot. Historians still argue whether this mobility truly loosened Victorian rules or simply transplanted them. Did trains liberate couples, or did families just invent new forms of supervision, extending chaperonage onto platforms and train cars? The debate lingers like the echo of steam whistles across valleys. Novels added fuel to the change, cheaply printed romances circulated widely, introducing bold heroines and passionate plots that mocked the rigidity of real life. Young women, warned by doctors not to overstimulate their imaginations, devoured them anyway. For some, fiction planted new ideas, that love could be chosen, that passion could triumph, that rules were meant to be bent. Parents feared these books like wildfire, but the fire was already spreading. And in cities, the economy shifted. More women entered the workforce as clerks, seamstresses, and teachers. More men crowded into offices and factories. Courtship now unfolded not just in parlours and pews, but in workplaces, lunch breaks, and evening strolls after long shifts. Chaperones still loomed, but cracks widened. Privacy was scarce, but possibility multiplied. You can almost feel the cultural corset loosening with each passing year. Couples dared to meet in bookstores, to exchange novels with inscriptions, to wander streets buzzing with gaslight and carriages. Etiquette manuals still scolded, gossip still circulated, but the sheer speed of change made the old rules harder to enforce. And yet contradictions remained. A young woman riding a train alone could still face harsh judgment. A young man who quoted too much from novels might be dismissed as frivolous. Society bent, but did not break. It was a slow shift, cautious and halting, like a waltz that stumbled but did not stop. So you sit at a station now, the air smelling of smoke and iron, watching as couples glance at each other across benches. A whistle shrieks and the train pulls forward, carrying away not just passengers, but entire traditions. Courtship still bears the weight of propriety, but with every mile of track laid, with every novel sold, the fabric of Victorian dating begins to unravel, thread by thread. The train whistle fades into the distance, but in its place comes the flutter of paper fans, the tap of coded footsteps, and the sly shimmer of rebellion. Because even as the rules remained tight, young lovers weren't passive prisoners. They invented their own languages, slipping signals past the sternest chaperones and nosiest sewing circles. Fans, for instance, were more than props against summer heat. A lady could hold her fan half open to signal interest, snap it shut to show annoyance, or drop it deliberately to invite a suitor's gallant rescue. Entire fan dictionaries circulated, some tongue-in-cheek, others dead serious, outlining how gestures replaced forbidden words. Imagine courtship playing out like a round of charades, only with lace and feathers. Here's your mainstream fact. Coded communication was rampant in 19th century social life. Beyond fans, couples used gloves, handkerchiefs, and even the way they arranged chairs in parlours to send signals. Scholars describe it as a shadow language of romance, operating in the cracks of propriety. Now for the quirky tidbit, some lovers used the placement of postage stamps on letters as secret confessions. A stamp tilted sideways might mean, "I long to see you," while one upside down signalled, "I love you." The post office became an unwitting accomplice in countless whispered romances. Historians still argue whether these codes were widely understood or just playful inventions among the bored middle class. Were fans truly read as languages, or did people invent the idea later as a charming myth? Some diaries confirm real use, while others suggest it was exaggerated. Still, even if half imagined, the very belief in secret codes gave couples a sense of agency in a world of surveillance. You can picture it vividly. A ball is underway, the orchestra swelling, and across the room a young woman flutters her fan once, twice, holding it near her cheek. The young man notices, heart pounding, unsure if he's reading it right, but desperate to believe he is. Later, at the punch bowl, she drops her glove. He retrieves it, his fingers brushing hers for a second too long. The chaperones see only politeness. The couple feels the thunder of rebellion, even in parlours where conversation was monitored. Small acts spoke volumes. A young lady might place a book slightly askew on the table to signal an agreed-upon message. A gentleman might tap his cane 3 times on the floor to say, "I'm thinking of you." These little rebellions gave romance texture, making the forbidden even sweeter. Compared to today's emojis or secret text codes, the Victorian system feels charmingly elaborate. Instead of a wink face emoji, you had to wield an entire fan with precision. Instead of "you up," at midnight you had to tilt a stamp just so. Perhaps the effort made it all the more thrilling. And that's the point. Rebellion lived in the margins. Love didn't collapse under propriety. It adapted, hiding in lace, ink, and winks disguised as etiquette. So you sit once more in the parlour, a fan stirring the heavy air, a letter tucked discreetly into a book, a handkerchief folded just so. To the untrained eye, nothing has happened. But to the couple across the room is alive with messages, whispers in plain sight, a rebellion made of silk and sighs. The fan closes, the hidden notes are tucked away, and the century itself begins to tip forward. By the 1890s, the old rituals, parlour visits, stiff chairs, endless etiquette manuals were beginning to feel creaky, even laughable. You sense it in the air. The world is moving faster, brighter, freer. The corset of Victorian dating is loosening, and something startlingly modern begins to emerge. Electric lights replace gas lamps, casting new kinds of glow across parlours and streets. Railroads crisscross the land, making visits easier, and cities thrum with theatres, ice cream parlours and Nickelodeons. Couples now have more places to go than just church pews or park benches. Imagine a young man nervously offering 2 cinema tickets instead of a stiffly worded calling card. Suddenly, romance has slipped out of the parlour and into the public eye. Here's your mainstream fact. By the turn of the century, dating as we know it began to appear in urban America. The word itself shifted meaning from a structured, family-supervised courtship toward a more casual, recreational outing. Dancing, dining, or strolling together became less about immediate marriage prospects and more about enjoyment, experimentation, and testing compatibility. Now, for the quirky tidbit, some reformers panicked about this new freedom. Social critics wrote editorials warning that ice cream parlours were dens of temptation, where dim lighting and sweet treats would inflame passions. Imagine milkshakes treated like contraband. Historians still argue whether this shift represented liberation or simply a new form of supervision. Were couples really free, or were they still judged only now by peers instead of parents? Evidence suggests both. Young people relished the chance to choose partners outside family matchmaking, but gossip still chased them, reshaped for the modern age. You can feel the transformation. Chaperones lose their grip, etiquette manuals gather dust, and the parlour loses its monopoly. Romance escapes into movie houses, amusement parks, and cafes. Gloved hands still brush, fans still flutter, but they now compete with popcorn and flickering screens. And yet, echoes of the old rules remain. Gossip doesn't vanish, it adapts. Class lines still cast shadows, race still divides cruelly, and gender double standards stubbornly cling. But the pace has quickened, and once freedom begins to taste sweet, it's hard to force it back into lace and velvet. So you drift at the cusp of a new century. Lovers sit closer on park benches, stroll unchaperoned down city streets, and choose partners not just through family arrangement, but through laughter, conversation, and chance. The Victorian parlour is fading into memory, its heavy drapes drawn shut, while the modern world creaks open its door. And with that you exhale, easing into the softest cadence, letting the long parade of rules dissolve into something gentler. Now it is time to rest. Imagine gas lamps flickering one last time, their glow fading into twilight. Picture the rustle of fans, the faint scratch of pens on paper, the echo of fiddles in a barn, slipping further and further away. Let the weight of those strange rules dissolve as the century turns, and let your own shoulders loosen with it. Because tonight the story ends, not with stiff chairs and watchful eyes, but with the promise of freedom, laughter, and simpler joys. Breathe slowly now, in through the nose, out through the mouth. Let your eyelids grow heavy. The rules of Victorian courtship can wait for another day. For now, the world grows quiet, the parlour empty, the benches vacant, the letters folded and put away. You are safe, you are still. You are, and the night carries you gently into rest.